Proclamation. All right. Don't forget the North also was able to manufacture more things, which was a distinct advantage. And don't forget, especially during Sherman's march to the sea, all the way up the southern coast, Georgia, Carolinas, just devastates the South's environment and their infrastructure. He did not target civilians as much as mythologized in history, except for possibly South Carolina. Okay, the Sherman's in his march to the sea, the orders were not to target any civilian targets, just kind of like military targets, infrastructure targets, railroad stations, things like that. And then once his army got to South Carolina, he was kind of disingenuous in his response when he was asked, why didn't you stop your soldiers from doing more than they were supposed to do and destroying more than they were supposed to and targeting civilians and burning down towns, and he just kind of, I can't stop them. I just can't stop them. They were out of control. And disingenuous kind of means he kind of knew better. He could have stopped them. But South Carolina was, they had been talking about secession for decades. They were the guys who almost seceded with the Tower of Abominations. John Calhoun was South Carolina. They were the first state to secede. So they were kind of like the face of the secessionist movement, so to speak. So they got by far the worst treatment from Sherman, who could have stopped his soldiers. All right. Roman numeral 2. The Civil War and Reconstruction altered power relationships between the states and the federal government and among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches in the national government, ending slavery and the notion of a divisible union, but leaving unresolved the questions of relative power between the state and the national, and largely unchanged social and economic patterns. A promise unfulfilled, or as our buddy Foner says, an unfinished revolution. All right. So the 13th Amendment, these are the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. And remember, the movie Lincoln by Spielberg, very good movie, but it sort of dramatizes the events because everyone kind of knew the amendment, that slavery was a dead dog by then. But the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, and it was necessary because, remember, the Emancipation Proclamation was a war measure, and at least theoretically, once the war was over, it was no longer valid. All right. Now, the South resists this, and you're going to see this. Of the 3 Reconstruction Amendments, the South finds a way around all 3. And that's the unfinished revolution part we were talking about. And that's why the second Reconstruction, or the Civil Rights Movement of the 20th century, was needed. So the national government says, slavery abolished. The South says, okay, we'll get around that by instituting something called sharecropping. Okay, freed slaves, former slaves would work on farms and exchange their labor for using land and housing. More or less, a planter would split up what used to be some slave shacks on the bottom of the hill, so to speak. He would split up his many acres into plots of land, and the slave would have to kind of borrow from somebody else for supplies. They would live on the land, and presumably, every time the harvest came in, half the crop would go to the owner of the land, the white owner, former slave owner. Half the crop would go to the slaves, but the owner of the property would decide how much he was going to pay for each crop, how much rent he was going to charge, how much he was going to charge for anything that had to be borrowed by the former slave to perform the services, the farming. So very often, the former slave would wind up actually in debt as a result of this. Also, the former slave owners would very often force the slaves into signing what were called labor contracts, which would, I don't want to say it was exactly like slavery, because it wasn't. There was more room for freedom by the former slaves, but it approximated it. It was as close as possible to what slavery was without crossing the law. Let's say that. All right. So sharecropping, you didn't own the land, and you were basically under the boot of the owner the entire time. All right. Extreme poverty as a result. half of their, as I said, half the crops were typically given to the landowner. Sharecroppers had to borrow money to get started, borrow supplies. Local stores would give out loans at high rates, what's called the crop lien system. All right, like loan sharks, sort of. Think of it that way. If cotton prices fell, and they did in the 1870s, perpetual debt was common for most sharecroppers. Debt peonage, it was called. So a majority of blacks in the South were sharecroppers by 1890. So the goal of sharecropping, the goal on the part of the South at least, was to approximate circumstances as close as they had been to prior to the Civil War. So that's how they got around the 13th Amendment: sharecropping, debt peonage, labor contracts. All right. Effects of Republicans' efforts to reconstruct the South. So this whole Reconstruction era represented a change in the balance of power between the presidency and Congress. During the war, Abe Lincoln had grabbed a lot of power for the presidency. All right. But after he was assassinated and Andrew Johnson, who you see there on the right, takes over, he becomes a very unpopular president, at least to his own Congress. He was very unpopular. He had vetoes overturned by Congress when he was trying to block things they were doing down south. You see, once the South surrendered at Appomattox, Andrew Johnson wanted the North, or the Union, to kind of relinquish their war powers. And what that would have meant is that there would not have really been there would not have been an ability by the Union to enforce any type of racial equality down south, which they tried to do for 14 years during Reconstruction. And guys like Thaddeus Stevens, who you see on the left-hand side there, of the radical Republicans in Congress, kind of said to themselves, if we don't keep our war powers even after the major fighting is over, then freedom will mean nothing for the freed slaves down south. So there was a clash between Congress and the president as to how to reconstruct the South. Again, Johnson wanted to relinquish war powers and just kind of wash his hands, so to speak, of Reconstruction efforts. And Thaddeus Stevens wanted to do it more forcibly, using the powers they gained during the war. So there was a clash between presidential Reconstruction and his Congress, and eventually Congress impeaches Andrew Johnson, and he agrees to not. He's found not guilty by one vote, and he agrees to not stand in the way of what Congress wants to do, which is to keep their war powers and to try and enforce racial equality down south. Okay? So, more or less, the southern states become readmitted to the Union once 10% of them apply or sign an oath to the Constitution, but also adopting the 13th Amendment or approving of the 13th Amendment was also a prerequisite to get back into the Union. All right. So, also during Reconstruction era, former slaves and those who had been free blacks before the war did see some expanded opportunity during Reconstruction, during that 14 years in which the Union did enforce racial equality, did enforce black people's ability to vote or to run for office down south. So you get guys like Robert Smalls. He was a steamer pilot that brought a ship to the Union Navy during the Civil War. He later becomes a congressman. Famous name, remember his name, Robert Smalls. Reconstruction and the Civil War also rearranged relationships between whites and blacks in the South, albeit temporarily, meaning during Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. Once 1877 hits and soldiers are gone, then that's over. That's when you see Jim Crow and segregation laws and so forth. But during those 14 years, you did see rearranged relationships down south. You have Hiram Revels, and this is great. This is fantastic. A senator from Mississippi, and he eventually wins Jefferson Davis's former seat in the Senate, which is fantastic. The first African American to serve in the Senate. So there was some successes. They never really did achieve a majority in any. African Americans never did achieve a majority in state assemblies. The closest, I think, was in South Carolina. And you do see some big name successes here, like Revels and Smalls. All right.